For centuries, the story of Europe's past seems simple, almost comforting. History books, museum exhibits, and popular imagination all painted the same picture. Europe's earliest ancestors were pale-skinned hunters, fair-haired farmers, and blue-eyed warriors. It was an image that felt familiar, even reassuring, a mirror held up to modern Europeans who saw themselves as a direct continuation of this unbroken lineage. But in the last 2 decades, a new science has quietly shattered that mirror. Ancient DNA analysis, extracted from bones buried for thousands of years, has revealed a truth that is stranger, more unsettling, and far more complex than anything historians once believed. The revelation did not arrive with a grand announcement or a dramatic archaeological discovery. It came silently, through fragile fragments of genetic code preserved in the densest parts of ancient skeletons. When scientists finally sequenced them, the results were so shocking that many refused to believe them at first. The story that emerged was not of a continent that had always been pale, but one that for most of its history was home to people with dark skin, dark hair, and strikingly diverse features. This was Europe's buried secret, a truth invisible in textbooks, ignored in reconstructions, and in some cases, quietly brushed aside by generations of scholars who could not imagine a past so different from their present. But the DNA does not lie. It speaks from beyond the grave, forcing us to confront a reality that rewrites everything we thought we knew about identity, ancestry, and the origins of Europe itself. So what exactly did the DNA reveal? How long did this hidden truth survive in silence? And why does it matter so much today? This is the story of how cutting-edge science cracked open the vault of history and exposed the secret that some would rather have stayed forgotten. For generations, the story of Europe's past had been told through fragments of stone, scattered tools, and broken pottery. Archaeologists reconstructed lives from arrowheads and fire pits, weaving narratives of migration and survival from clues left behind in the soil. But the truth of appearance, the skin, the eyes, the faces of ancient people, remained an enigma. Artists filled the gap. Museums displayed mannequins of Ice Age hunters with pale skin and northern features. Illustrations in textbooks showed Neolithic farmers with light complexions, as if modern Europeans had simply stepped out of the past unchanged. These depictions became so ingrained that they were rarely questioned. The assumption was simple: Europeans had always looked European. But then, in the early 21st century, the science of ancient DNA exploded onto the scene. By extracting genetic material from the bones of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago, scientists could peer directly into the biological code of the past. And what they saw overturned centuries of assumptions in a matter of months. The genomes told a story that no artifact ever could. For tens of thousands of years, the people who lived in Europe were not pale-skinned at all. They carried genes for dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes, traits inherited from their African ancestors. This was not a fringe discovery or an isolated outlier. It was consistent across samples, from hunter-gatherer remains in Iberia to skeletons unearthed in Central Europe. Even more surprising, some of these dark-skinned Europeans had piercing blue eyes. This unusual combination, deep pigmentation with light-colored eyes, is rare in the modern world, but it appears to have been common among Europe's Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. The implications were enormous. If Europe's earliest inhabitants looked nothing like the pale figures once imagined, then the familiar image of European ancestry was not just wrong, it was a myth, built on cultural bias and the absence of genetic evidence. This was the moment everything changed. The story of Europe's origins was no longer a tale told only through tools and bones. It had become a story told in code, genetic sequences that revealed the hidden history of an entire continent. And what the code revealed was not the smooth, unbroken line of continuity historians once believed, but a patchwork of migrations, mixtures, and transformations that spanned thousands of years. The first great shock was simple but devastating. Pale skin, the trait so often thought of as Europe's defining feature, was a late arrival. For most of human history on the continent, it simply did not exist. And yet, if the earliest Europeans were dark-skinned, the question arises, when and how did Europe become pale? And why was this truth buried in silence for so long? Tens of thousands of years ago, long before cities or kingdoms, before Europe was carved into nations, the first modern humans set foot on the continent. They were migrants out of Africa, carrying with them the genetic inheritance of their ancestors: dark skin, dark hair, and eyes that reflected the evolutionary needs of life under the sun. These early Europeans were not strangers to the light of the tropics. Their pigmentation was their shield, protecting them from ultraviolet rays honed over countless generations in Africa. When they crossed into Europe, a land of colder skies and shorter days, their skin did not immediately change. Evolution works in slow, deliberate steps over thousands of generations, not a few lifetimes. Life for these hunter-gatherers was brutal and demanding. Small groups, sometimes numbering only a few dozen, roamed vast landscapes. They hunted reindeer, aurochs, and wild cattle. They gathered berries and nuts. They carved shelters out of bone and hide, built fires against the long winters, and followed herds across frozen plains. In this harsh world, survival mattered more than appearance. And yet, the DNA reveals something extraordinary. Many of these early Europeans, while dark-skinned, carried genes for striking blue eyes. The combination was startling: deep pigmentation paired with piercing, light eyes. Today, this mix is rare, but in Mesolithic Europe, it seems to have been surprisingly common. Archaeological finds from Spain, Hungary, and Scandinavia confirm the pattern. Skeletons dating back thousands of years reveal the same surprising blend. For generations, historians had assumed Europe's first inhabitants resembled their modern descendants. But the faces of these hunter-gatherers would have looked completely unfamiliar to us today, a reminder that the human story is always more complex than the myths we inherit. And then came one discovery that forced the world to look this truth in the eye. A skeleton found in a dark cave in Somerset, England. A man who lived 10,000 years ago. His DNA would change everything we thought we knew about the origins of Britain and about Europe itself. In 1903, deep inside Gough's Cave in Somerset's Cheddar Gorge, workers made an astonishing find. Lying undisturbed for nearly 10,000 years was a nearly complete skeleton of a man from the Mesolithic era. He became known as Cheddar Man, and for over a century, his bones were studied, displayed, and speculated upon. But no one truly knew what he looked like. Artists reconstructed his face based on assumptions that ancient Britons must have resembled their modern descendants. The image was familiar: pale skin, perhaps light brown or blonde hair, the face of someone who might walk the streets of London today. For decades, this picture went unchallenged. Then, in 2018, scientists did something unthinkable. They extracted DNA from the petrous bone, the dense inner ear bone that preserves genetic material better than almost any other part of the skeleton. What they found stunned the world. Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest known inhabitant, almost certainly had dark to very dark skin, curly dark hair, and piercing blue eyes. The revelation was explosive, not because the science was uncertain, but because it clashed so violently with cultural expectations. For the first time, the public was confronted with a portrait of their ancient ancestor that looked nothing like the pale-skinned Britons they imagined. The reactions were telling. Some embraced the discovery, fascinated by the diversity of Europe's past.
Others bristled, dismissing it as politically motivated or even impossible. But the genome did not lie. Cheddar Man's DNA matched the profile of Western hunter-gatherers who lived across Europe, from Iberia to Hungary. He was not an anomaly, he was the majority. For more than a century, Cheddar Man had been a silent witness to Britain's forgotten ancestry. But with the release of his genetic portrait, he became a symbol of a deeper truth. Europe's early inhabitants looked nothing like the pale figures of school textbooks and museum dioramas. Their faces were darker, more varied, and far more surprising. Cheddar Man forced the world to confront a secret hidden in plain sight. The whiteness of Europe was not timeless, it was new, a late arrival in the long sweep of human history. Before the first seeds were planted in European soil, before plows carved the land into fields, Europe was a continent of hunter-gatherers. For thousands of years after the Ice Age, small bands of people roamed forests, rivers, and coastlines, living entirely off the land. Their world was raw and demanding. Winters were long and brutal, summers short but abundant. Communities moved with the seasons, tracking herds of red deer, fishing in clear rivers, gathering hazelnuts, berries, and roots. Tools were simple: flint blades, bone harpoons, and bows. Fire was their constant companion, a source of warmth, protection, and survival. But what's most striking is this. The DNA tells us these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers across Europe, from Spain to Scandinavia, shared the same dark skin and blue-eyed combination seen in Cheddar Man. It wasn't an exception, it was the rule. For generation after generation, Europe's population remained small and scattered. The land could not support large numbers without farming. Survival meant adaptability, cooperation, and mobility. And through it all, their physical appearance remained largely unchanged from the people who first migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. Then, around 8,000 years ago, everything shifted. A new wave of people began arriving from the east, farmers from Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey. They brought with them something that would transform not just how people lived, but who they became: agriculture. It was the turning point when dark-skinned hunter-gatherers would meet pale-skinned newcomers. The meeting of these two groups, the ancient Europeans of the forests and the farmers of the Fertile Crescent, would set in motion the genetic transformation that shaped the Europe we recognize today. Around 8,000 years ago, the silence of Europe's forests was broken by a new kind of people. They came not as wandering hunters, but as settlers, farmers. Their origins lay far to the east, in the fertile valleys of Anatolia, what is now Turkey. They brought with them a different genetic code. They had lighter skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. And they brought with them something that would change the very rhythm of life: agriculture.
With them came wheat and barley, sheep and goats, and a way of living that would anchor humans to the land. Villages began to rise. Instead of chasing herds, people planted crops. Instead of following seasons, they built permanent homes. For the first time, Europe's landscape echoed with the sounds of farming: the cutting of fields, the pounding of grain, the bleating of livestock. But this was not a story of simple replacement. It was a story of mixing. The Anatolian farmers spread westward, carrying their genes and their lifestyle with them. Wherever they went, they encountered Europe's hunter-gatherers. Sometimes the two groups clashed, competing for territory and resources. But often they mingled, sharing bloodlines, exchanging knowledge, and blending worlds. And from this mixing, something new began to emerge. The DNA tells us that the farmers' lighter skin genes started spreading across the continent. Slowly, generation after generation, Europe's complexion began to change. It wasn't uniform, nor was it immediate. For centuries, the continent was a patchwork: dark-skinned hunter-gatherers in one valley, lighter-skinned farmers in another. The face of Europe was becoming more varied, more complex. But this was only the first wave. A second migration, one even more dramatic, was still to come. And when it did, it would reshape Europe's people, languages, and even its future. Around 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, a new wave of people arrived from the vast grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, far to the east. They were herders, warriors, and skilled horsemen, moving across Europe with unprecedented mobility. Archaeologists call them the Yamnaya culture, and their arrival marked one of the most dramatic chapters in Europe's genetic story. These steppe invaders carried with them light skin, lighter hair, and new genetic variations that would eventually dominate the continent. They also brought bronze weapons, advanced animal husbandry, and technologies that allowed them to travel great distances, connect distant communities, and displace or absorb the populations they encountered. For the first time, the genetic makeup of Europe shifted on a massive scale. Hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers were joined by a third major ancestral group, each contributing unique traits to the European mosaic. The combination of these ancestries created a complex genetic patchwork, one in which dark-skinned hunter-gatherers with light eyes still existed, but increasingly became outnumbered. And yet, even with this enormous influx of lighter pigmentation, dark skin persisted. DNA analysis shows that for thousands of years, Europe was not yet pale. Even in regions dominated by steppe ancestry, many individuals retained the dark skin of their Mesolithic ancestors. This persistence challenges assumptions about evolution, migration, and natural selection. The genes for lighter skin were present, but they did not immediately become dominant. Evolution works slowly, shaped not only by survival, but by chance, cultural practices, and dietary shifts. By the Bronze Age, the population of Europe had been transformed culturally, technologically, and genetically. But the full transition to the pale-skinned Europe familiar to modern eyes would not be complete for another 1,000 years or more. This slow, uneven process reminds us that history is not linear, and that appearance, something so central to identity, is far from fixed. It is fluid, shaped by migration, environment, and the intricate dance of genes over millennia. Section 8. Why dark skin persisted until the Iron Age. Even after the arrival of farmers and steppe herders, dark skin remained common across much of Europe. This persistence is one of the most striking revelations from ancient DNA studies, and it challenges centuries of assumptions about the continent's past. Why did lighter pigmentation take so long to dominate? One explanation lies in evolutionary advantage. Darker skin protects against ultraviolet radiation, which even in temperate climates could still pose risks during summer months. It shields DNA from damage, prevents folate depletion, and offers subtle metabolic benefits that may have contributed to survival in early European societies. Another factor was dietary adaptation. Hunter-gatherers consumed a protein-rich diet of fish, game, and wild plants, all rich in vitamin D. When farming became widespread, grains replaced much of this diet. In northern latitudes, sunlight was limited, and vitamin D absorption became a crucial factor for survival. Individuals with lighter skin synthesized vitamin D more efficiently, giving them a slight advantage, but only gradually. Evolutionary changes spread slowly over many generations. Cultural and demographic factors also played a role. Europe's early populations were small and isolated. Random chance, known as genetic drift, could magnify certain traits in some communities while diminishing others. Small populations meant that even advantageous traits took centuries to spread widely. Interestingly, eye color diversified much earlier than skin color. Blue and green eyes appear in European DNA as early as 14,000 years ago, long before widespread lighter skin. This created the striking combinations we see in Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Dark skin with blue or green eyes, a look that seems unusual today, but once was the norm. By the Iron Age, around 3,000 years ago, lighter pigmentation began to dominate in most regions, but the transition was uneven. In some areas, dark-skinned individuals with light eyes continued to appear. These findings reveal a Europe far more complex and diverse than the uniform pale continent imagined in textbooks. The old assumption that Europe had always been pale is now proven to be a historical illusion. Whiteness, as we know it today, is not ancient. It is recent, shaped by migration, selection, and centuries of slow evolutionary change.
If Europe was home to dark-skinned people for tens of thousands of years, why does history portray it as pale? Why did textbooks, museums, and art consistently depict Ice Age hunters, Neolithic farmers, and even Bronze Age individuals as light-skinned? The answer is complex. Few scholars deliberately sought to hide the truth. Instead, cultural assumptions shaped perception. In 19th and early 20th century Europe, whiteness was assumed to be ancient, natural, and defining. When archaeologists reconstructed faces or created museum displays, they projected these assumptions onto the past. Artists and illustrators had limited evidence. DNA analysis was impossible, and fossilized bones offered little clue about pigmentation. The safest, most believable depiction was to mirror contemporary Europeans: pale skin, fair features, a familiar visage. Over time, these reconstructions became canon. School books, museum dioramas, and scientific literature repeated the same imagery, solidifying a myth of continuity. It wasn't until the rise of ancient DNA research that this facade began to crack. For the first time, scientists could read the genetic code preserved in bones, revealing physical traits with precision. Cheddar Man's reconstruction in 2018 exemplified this revolution. Dark skin, curly dark hair, and blue eyes. The revelation clashed violently with long-held cultural narratives, forcing a reevaluation not just of biology, but of identity. Public reactions reflected this tension. Some welcomed the correction, seeing it as a celebration of human diversity and a reminder that Europe's past was far richer than imagined. Others rejected it, claiming the science was politically motivated or implausible. Yet the genome could not lie. It offered data, not opinion. The lesson is clear. History is never neutral. It is filtered through the lens of those who write it, influenced by social norms, ideology, and limited knowledge. Ancient DNA does not fabricate history. It restores it, revealing truths that were invisible to earlier generations. Europe's story, once simplified and sanitized, is now emerging as messy, dynamic, and diverse. Dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, lighter-skinned farmers, steppe herders, and countless mixed generations. These are the people who shaped the continent over millennia. The revelations of ancient DNA do more than satisfy curiosity about the past. They challenge how we see ourselves today. Europe's first inhabitants did not look like the continent imagined in paintings, films, or textbooks. They were darker-skinned, genetically diverse, and culturally complex. Their faces disrupt comforting myths of a static, homogeneous ancestry. Reconstructing these faces is not simply a scientific exercise. It carries ethical responsibilities. A genome can predict skin tone, hair color, and eye color with high probability, but it cannot produce a perfect photograph of the past. Ancient individuals are not objects for sensationalism. They deserve respect, nuance, and careful interpretation. Reducing them to symbols or cultural battlegrounds risks oversimplifying a story that spans tens of thousands of years. Yet the impact cannot be denied. These findings illuminate the fluidity of human traits. Skin color, once thought immutable or tied to identity, is shown to be remarkably malleable, shaped by environment, diet, migration, and chance. Europe's whiteness is not timeless. It is the product of evolutionary pressures, demographic shifts, and historical contingencies. The discoveries of Cheddar Man, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and steppe herders remind us that migration, mixture, and change are constants in the human story, not exceptions. They teach a deeper lesson.
Diversity is the norm, and assumptions about natural appearances can obscure the complexity of history. Today, classrooms are rewriting lesson plans, museums are updating exhibits, scientists continue to explore genomes across the continent, piecing together Europe's intricate genetic mosaic. And the public is confronting a truth that can be unsettling but also empowering. Identity is never fixed. It is shaped by ancestry, environment, and the choices of countless generations. The revelation of Europe's darkest secret is not a scandal or a cover-up. It is a truth long hidden in the bones and DNA of our ancestors, waiting for modern science to read it at last. The continent's first inhabitants were survivors, innovators, and travelers, dark-skinned, light-eyed, and far more diverse than we had allowed ourselves to imagine. So what does this mean for us today? It challenges us to rethink assumptions about race, history, and heritage. It shows that the past is not a static mirror of the present, but a living tapestry of change, resilience, and adaptation. DNA has not rewritten history. It has restored it. It has filled in the chapters that were invisible, ignored, or misunderstood. As we look to the future, the story of Europe's first people offers a profound reminder. Our identities, our appearances, our cultures are products of a long, complex journey. And in learning to see the past clearly, we gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the shared human story that connects us all. So do you believe this hidden history was lost, ignored, or deliberately hidden? One thing is certain, the truth was always waiting, encoded in the DNA of those who came before us, ready to speak at last. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us next time as we uncover more hidden truths buried in the past.